Hi again. Here we are to continue our discussion of JavaScript. In the last example, I linked to main.js, and I just did some examples all in the console. Okay. In this example, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce how JavaScript will work with elements in the DOM. Okay, so this will just get us started. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete the link here to the main.js. And I'm going to write all of my JavaScript this time inside the script tag. Now remember, in the first video I said that you could do this, right? So I'm going to do it here, and I'm not going to use those other scripts in main. We could have done everything that I type here in main if we wanted, okay? But just to show you that you can do it here, and because if I write it here and I talk about, and my JavaScript references something in the DOM, we'll be able to see them both together, okay? So what are we going to do? Let's make an h1 tag in here, and then we're going to give it an ID, okay? And we'll call it title, okay? And then we'll put some question marks in there. And now what I want to do is I want to get a reference to this div title and set the text inside title via JavaScript, okay? So what we'll do is I'm gonna do it this way. There's a couple ways to do this. I'm gonna do it this way for now because I think this is kind of the easiest way to understand it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a variable called title. Now the name here could be anything you like, but I'm gonna name it the same as this guy just to kind of remind me that these are the same, but they don't have to be the same, right? To get a reference to an element in the DOM, what you'll do is you'll say document.getElementById. Okay, now you can get an element by its tag name, by its class name, and some other ways. The ID name is kind of the easiest way to understand this, though. So I'm going to start with this. Okay. So I'm going to say getElementById, and of course, I have to put the ID name here. Now this name right here must match the spelling of the ID that you have here. This could be anything you like. This one must match. Hey, they're even the same color, right? So now I've got a reference to this element, right? And when I have that, then I can do things with it. So I could say title dot, and one of the things you can do is if you want to change the text inside of an element, you can use the inner HTML property, and you can set it to anything you want. Why don't we make that hello world again? Okay, here's a little note. I didn't mention it earlier, but every line, every expression, like one line of code is called an expression. Every expression should end with a semicolon. JavaScript is actually kind of loose about this. You can leave that off, and it kind of still works most of the time, right? Or almost all the time, but every once in a while you run into a situation where it actually will have a problem with that. So the intention is that you should have a semicolon at the end of the line, okay? So you'll notice I've been trying to put those in, right? So anyway, here we are, right? So let's give it a quick test. So I'll go to my page. This was the page we had before. We can close the console now, and I'll refresh it, and you can see it says hello world, right? Let's inspect that for a moment and take a look here. And you can see, like in the H1 here, that the script changed this to hello world. And if I look at the script here, you can see there's the code that ran, okay? So there's our code, right? Again, we're using document getElementById title, okay, right? And so the ID is the name here. So we don't have to say the ID here. We don't have to include the hash mark like you would with CSS. You just put the name, and it just has to match the spelling. Now, JavaScript, when it looks for an ID for an element, it looks for the first element in the DOM with that ID name. So if you had a second element here with the same ID name, it won't find the second one. So watch what happens. If I have two of these and I refresh, the second one doesn't get changed to hello world. It's never even seen. Like JavaScript just ignores it. ID names are meant to be unique. So even though you can type the ID name more than once in the DOM here, when you're using JavaScript, it's only going to find the ID once, okay? And it'll be the first one that it finds, starting from the top of the page, working its way down. So the first tag here, it'll look, does it have that ID? If it does, it stops there. If not, it goes to the next item, and it keeps working its way to the bottom, okay? One more thing, okay? You can put your JavaScript anywhere you want. So I could put it in the head of my document like this, Notice now it's in the head. Watch what happens this time though. I'll save the file there and I'll refresh it in the browser, and you'll notice my JavaScript didn't work. It didn't set the text here, and if I inspect it, there's no errors either. Or I guess there is an error. It says null is not an object defining inner HTML for this element, right? So it's telling me like, hey, you know, you don't have, and actually null is kind of another kind of non-value similar to undefined, but a little bit different. Like JavaScript gets a little weird sometimes. But anyway, it says, hey, you know, it's trying to find inner HTML or title.inner HTML. And so actually title is what's null, and it doesn't have, so then we can't get the inner HTML property of it. And why is that? Well, we've got the item here, okay? The problem is when JavaScript executes, essentially your page is loaded from the top here. And so when the JavaScript executes, in my case, in this document here, it executes after this script tag is loaded. So the selected area is, you know, imagine that as what we've loaded. And then the bottom area here hasn't been loaded yet. So when we run this line, getElementById, there isn't any element, like this thing doesn't exist yet. Imagine like that's, you know, missing, right? So we ran this code and it couldn't find an element with the ID name title. It ran this line of code and this title thing was null or undefined, and so, you know, we were unable to set the inner HTML of it, okay? Right, so how do you get around that? Well, you know, the same thing will happen even if you put the script tag here, and you're totally allowed to put it inside the body tag. I did that earlier. Let me actually kind of clean that up a little bit there, right? Okay. You can put it there and we'll still get the same effect, right? Still same problem, same error, right? And the problem again is this element hasn't loaded yet. So this is why I like to put the script tag at the bottom of the page. Okay, so after all of my HTML code, at the very bottom, the last thing inside the body tag, I like to put my JavaScript here. And then I know that everything at the top of the page is loaded before the JavaScript goes off. And it's the last thing here, so I know that everything is loaded and I'll be able to find any elements that I'm referencing, okay? So we'll save that and we'll go back to the browser here and refresh it, and now it's working, okay? Let's do one more thing here, right? So what if we had an input element? Now an input element, let me actually put that inside a paragraph too. I'm going to say input. I'm going to put it inside a paragraph because normally the input element is it's an inline element, so it'll act funny sometimes if we don't wrap it in a block. So I'll put it in this paragraph, and that'll get a little margin at the top too. So we'll give it an ID. We'll call it, how about my input, right? And an input, again, it's like a text input. So if I look at the page, you can see the input is the text field here. You know, we can type something into it, right? So what if I want to get the value out of the input, right? Okay, so we'll do one more example here. I'm going to add a button here. Okay, and I'll say, how about we'll just call that button test, and then I'll give it ID my button, right? So we're going to do two things here. We're going to listen for a click on the button, and then when we click the button, we're going to get the value stored in the input field. So the value is the text that you type into the field. Okay, so first of all, let's do the same process we did earlier. Let's say var button equals document getElementById. The ID name is my button. And then let's get our input field too. So let's say input equals document.getElementById. And this one was my input, okay? And then maybe a little lower down here, we'll do this. We'll say button dot add event listener, okay? And so event listeners listen for events and events are things that happen at some object, okay? And there's a lot of different events you can listen for. In the case of pretty much anything that you see on the screen, you can listen for a click event. So add event listener actually takes 3 parameters. They're not all required though. So the first one, we're just going to use 2 of them here. So the first parameter is the string, the name of the event that you're listening for. I know you'd think there'd be a constant or something for this, but you just use a string. And then we'll say comma. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call on a function. And actually JavaScript is all about closures. So what we'll do is we'll actually just type the function, an anonymous function in here. So we can just type the function syntax there. So we got function, parentheses, curly brackets. We don't need to give it a name. It's anonymous. And I'm going to put a line return between the curly braces here. And this will be the code for our event listener. And this is a pretty common form for this kind of stuff in JavaScript, okay? And actually, this function right here will receive an event object describing the event. So if you put a variable here, you can grab that event object because maybe you want to do something with it, okay? We're not actually going to use this here, but I'll put that there as a reminder. Okay, so what happened here? We have a button or an element that has an ID name, right? And we named it button, and it's going to be this guy here. So we've gotten a reference to it. And then we're going to say button, hey, let's add an event listener to you. Let's listen for an event, and the event we're going to listen for is called click. Okay, so that means you clicked it with the mouse. You pressed the button and released it over this element right here, okay? And then when that happens, this function will be executed. And then JavaScript will wrap up an event object describing the event that just occurred. So the event object has information in it like where you clicked on the screen, the object that you clicked on, and some other things, okay? Like I said, we're not even going to use this here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the text from the input field and put it into the H1. Okay, so it'll be just like a little simple, maneuver with our JavaScript. So what we'll do is we'll say title dot inner HTML equals input, which if you recall is this guy, right? Document getElementById my input, which is this input field here, right? And an input element has a value property, and the value is the text that you typed into the input field, okay? So we'll get the string from the input field and put it into the HTML of the title, and that will make the text from the input field appear here inside the H1. Okay, so that's just like a simple example, just to, just learn a little bit about how JavaScript works. I'll type in A, B, C, D, and then I'll click test, and then it says A, B, C, D. Okay, so there's a simple example for you, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'll click test, and then it appears there, okay? So hopefully that gets you started with your JavaScript and gives you an idea of how you might reference an element by its ID name and how you might work with some of the simple properties of some objects. Right now, notice value belongs to input fields and some other form elements. The button doesn't have a value and the H1 doesn't have a value. So if you wanted the text out of the H1 here, you'd have to use inner HTML to get the content text. Okay? So anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll continue with some other videos, and I hope that's helpful.